Too often the world seems consumed with conflict. People divided by sharply opposing views. But we ask, is there another way forward? In the spirit of inclusive friendship, can we move our conversations from polarized debate to peaceful dialogue, acknowledging the reality of life together on this planet? Prompted by these questions, the Inspired Dialogue Foundation explores alternative forms of conversation to create new ways of coming together. We thank you and the Cambridge Festival 2021 for supporting the mission of dialogue.
Hello, I'm Cameron Taylor at the Inspired Dialogue Foundation, and I am thrilled to be able to introduce our first virtual event. The Inspired Dialogue Foundation is a UK charitable organization. We're committed to promoting dialogue as a different mode of engagement, and Rowan will elaborate on what we mean by this. We've been hosting these dialogues since 2015, when Rowan hosted the Dalai Lama in Cambridge. And our most recent event was in person, and we were fortunate to be able to host members of the Tutsi and Hutu communities from Rwanda to learn how dialogue has been so integral to the reconciliation process following the genocide of the Tutsi. We're very pleased to be part of the first virtual Cambridge Festival of Ideas, and thank you very much for inviting us to be part of it. In our program today, we have three unique perspectives. Reflecting on the challenges of how we can have honest conversations facing the painful truth of our present and past, and also where we can magnify areas of hope through education and dialogue. Let me introduce our three participants. Dr. Rowan Williams is our host and moderator. He is retired from his role as Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, and as you know, is the former Archbishop of Canterbury. And as mentor, host, and trustee, Rowan has been integral to everything that we've done at the foundation, and one of the great moral leaders of our time. And he's somebody that I'm extremely grateful is able to host these conversations. The amazing Jude Kelly is founder and director of the Women of the World Foundation. She's the former artistic director of the Southbank Centre, a longtime advocate for gender equality, and a truly global leader in the art world. And as I'm sure you will find out in the next hour or so, if you didn't already know, a powerful voice for change. Her foundation seeks to empower women everywhere to achieve independence, economic success, and a voice in the community. And it's a real honor to have her joining us again. She's been a wonderful friend to us in these dialogues. Finally, Christian Picciolini is joining us from the US. He's author of the gripping and important book, Breaking Hate: Confronting the New Culture of Extremism, which I highly recommend reading. He founded the Free Radicals Project, which helps people disengage from extremist groups. We are incredibly honored that he's able to share with us from his personal experiences, having been a former leader in the white nationalist movement in the US, and now a committed leader taking action every day to move us in a direction of hope. A heartfelt thank you to all of you for joining us. Each person will take a few minutes to speak, then we'll move to a dialogue, and who knows what'll happen. I now will turn it over to our host and moderator, Dr. Williams.
Cameron, thank you very much indeed for your introduction and for all that you've done for the Inspired Dialogue Foundation over the years. It's an enormous privilege to be hosting this conversation with two such very remarkable people alongside me here. And I want to introduce this by framing the discussion with a couple of thoughts about the nature of dialogue and why it's difficult. People sometimes think that dialogue is almost an easy option. Oh, it's a way of avoiding conflict. It's a way of parking the issues that we don't really want to disagree about publicly or too vocally. But authentic dialogue is an experience which takes us into a place that neither party really owns, possesses, or controls. And that's why it's difficult and risky and absolutely necessary. It won't have escaped anybody's notice that at the moment we're living in a deeply polarized world where people retreat into the territory that they feel they are in charge of, the territory that they can police, whose boundaries they can firm up against others. The echo chambers of the electronic world, the echo chambers of most kinds of politics in the world we're familiar with. And part of what this means, of course, is a situation where people feel that those they disagree with are not simply mistaken or taking another path, but actively dangerous and even actively wicked and destructive. The other is a threat to me, and I am a threat to that other. And it's that zero-sum level of confrontation that dialogue challenges. It challenges it first by reminding us that the other is never going to disappear. I and we, in our controlled territory, are never going to be in a position so to control the world that nobody ever is different from us. The other is there. We have to find a way of making a world together, because otherwise neither will survive. And that means that, like it or not, we depend upon one another. In the long run, my security and yours belong together. I am safer when you are safer. I am healthier when you are healthier. And if we've learned nothing else from the traumatic experience of the last 12 months of pandemic and lockdown, surely we should have learned that. Our health, our well-being, is a global affair, not local. So we depend on one another. We are bound to one another, like it or not. And so a sensible way forward might be just to say, how do we make that inescapable belonging together something creative, something that constantly builds new perspective and new possibility for all of us? So we move into the space of dialogue. We move into a place where it's possible to believe that people can change, and a space where it's possible to believe that people are willing to make themselves a little bit less safe for a moment so that they may be safer together in the long run. A space, therefore, where some of what we take for granted about power is put on hold. People are often suspicious of dialogue programs when they're heavily dictated by somebody who has an agenda, an interest, and an advantage. And dialogue, of course, is never authentic when it is dominated by somebody's power, somebody's agenda, seeking just to absorb and ultimately to silence. No, we're looking together for something that will renew and enlarge the world for both parties. And we act on that extraordinary faith and confidence that people do change, people grow. We'll be hearing about that in different ways from our speakers today. But it's important that we put that up front right at the beginning. One of the most lethal, one of the most toxic elements in our world today is the way in which we act as if the other will never change or grow, and that I will never change or grow, and therefore it's you or me. We can't both grow together. I've spoken a bit about the risks of dialogue. And that's why it's important, as we've discovered in the work of Inspire Dialogue, to try to create an environment in which people feel safe enough to take risks, where there's enough patience around and enough time being given for people to put forward things which may perhaps be challenged, turned inside out, questioned in all sorts of ways. where they may feel a bit less secure as things go on, but nonetheless feel confident enough to keep putting one foot in front of the other, because they know that around them are people committed to listening, committed to giving time. So today we'll be reflecting on what some of those risks are, what sort of growth we believe is possible. We'll be sharing stories and experience of how we've seen that happen. We will above all be advocating for and pleading for a renewal of our political and social discourse that steps back from that fatal assumption that people don't change and don't grow. Inspire Dialogue is a foundation with a strong educational vision, and we'll be looking at what sort of skills we might need and what sort of resources we might need in order to think about how we educate a growing generation in dialogue. We hope that this exchange will speak to and invite in many people watching, reflecting, people perhaps who want to spread the word that what we're talking about is not an idle hope, but something we have seen happening and want to see rather more of. And so without more ado, I'll turn over at this point to Jude to lead us into the next bit of the discussion. Jude, lovely to have you. Please, over to you.
Thanks, Rowan. It's wonderful to spend a meditative time together, because in a way that is what we're doing, isn't it? We're just picking up some stones, looking at them, putting them back down again, and thinking if we rearrange them in different ways, would that produce a different result for us all? Because what we're going to be talking about, we've all talked about over the ages, and our ancestors have talked about, and our the next generation, the generation after, we'll carry on talking about it, because I'm so aware that humans are so challenged by each other. I've got a 2.5-year-old grandchild at the moment who is really keen to frighten people. And she wants to do that because she wants to feel powerful. And I can quite understand why she'd want to terrorize somebody who's 6 foot and make her feel better as a result. So giving her both the power to do it and taking it away from her as well, so she doesn't do any damage, is something about helping her grow. I really wanted to talk about the fact that when I was a little girl, a little bit older than her, and I grew up in Liverpool, and my father was one of 14 children, and my immediate neighborhood was very, very mixed. We were brought up in Chinatown in Upper Parliament Street, and I went to ballet in the West Indian Centre, and our background was sort of Irish Catholic. But when we moved as part of upward mobility, we moved to an all-white area. And I didn't understand that that was what was happening, but I can look back and see that as something that people thought was a good progression, a sort of certainty of what upward mobility ought to contain, which was essentially some level of separation that denoted status. Very damaging when you think that the world should be united, but something that goes into your kind of consciousness as the norm. And so even then I could see that one certainty, i.e. this very mixed neighborhood, was being replaced by a different kind of certainty that was more proper. And that is the beginning, I think, of my questioning around whether being proper is actually a dangerous place to be. Along with that, became a realization that there was a certainty running through my whole social life, because I'm one of 4 daughters, which was that girls, however wonderful and interesting and talented, were not as good as boys, because the whole world had orchestrated a philosophy, a framework, a theology, a historical canon that put you as a girl in a place of second place, and that this was a certainty. So when in your heart and soul you felt this couldn't be right, that this didn't tally with your sense of personal justice, you didn't really know how to proceed with the dialogue, because you could only be questioning something which everybody else felt was correct. So it was like, well, I think the world isn't round. And people would say, well, I'm afraid we've proved it is. And so again, it was very hard to know if that was the proper place that everybody had decided upon. Does that make me improper if I think differently? And I think a huge amount of trying to reach out to make change happen in the world is having to get over a sense of shame that you're on the side asking for a different worldview. Because the very act of asking for a different worldview, if you belong to the group that have been told that you're not as good as, or not as worthy of, or not as necessary to, you begin from the idea that you're being preposterous and uppity. And you've got to do so many internal battles, including the idea of that it's shameful that you're letting yourself down, letting other people down, and also that you don't even have a direction of travel, because you can't say, do you remember that world that existed once when we all did this? Could we return to it, please? You're having to take an act of emotional imagination on your own behalf, and maybe others who can share with you, and then persuade people who are very happy with the situation that the world is as they it provides them with certainties, and ask them to go into dialogue with you in a way that would make their life seemingly worse. That's a tricky thing to do. I mean, that is why so often we are pleading with people who have power to come and walk in the shoes of those who don't, so that we can say, if you could make the argument for equality, just think how more authentic that would be, in the sense of you are already legitimized. You are allowed to make up a new world because you are already the master of this one. I say that as somebody who's studied as well a lot about girls in relationship to their fathers. If you have a father who's endorsed you as a girl, you undoubtedly will be more confident, more powerful, have a greater sense of self-love, because if you like, the imagery of patriarchy that is the father that you love has said, you're a good one, you go forth. And that was my experience with my father. But you're always then coming into contact with other people, women as well as men, who are saying, if you shake this tree of certainty for me, you are being improper, you're being subversive, and you're going to make me unhappy. And so you also have got to carry with you an anxiety about the guilt of hurting people. And all of this, of course, could halt you in your tracks. But you said at the beginning that we had to kind of build on the idea of hope for change. And the reason why I get so excited about human progress is because I'm the product of it. Well, so are you. So are we all in this dialogue. I imagine that we would all have been serfs. I would imagine we would all have been, part of a feudal system and been near the bottom of it, since the majority of humanity was. And here we all are with our degrees and our books and our this, that, and the other. And, and as a woman, I have birth control and I have a vote and I have education. So I have the evidence that bit by bit, the world wanted to shift its certainties and have new certainties. And that makes me thrilled, because I feel as if I can be part of a world in action for change. Now, early on, from when I moved house into this all-white area, and also when I felt as if it was wrong that I should be the person tied up on a tree to be rescued and not allowed to ride a pretend horse or carry a pretend gun, I always knew that this was something what I had to fight for in terms of personal rights for girls and women. But I've learned so much more since then, because I'm a white woman, and I'm a white woman from the global north, and I'm a white cisgendered woman from the global north. And so I have lots of things that I can carry, which are my certainties, but they're also my power and my oppressive potential. And so I'm trying to both learn all the time how to find the right dialogue for giving people who have certainties that block me, but also how to unlearn parts of my own history and sense of norms so that I cannot be the barrier to somebody else's progress. And that means that I'm not only asking other people to change, but I'm changing too, I hope. And that continual metamorphosis, it's got to be something that people yearn for. And it is frightening, but it's also the stuff of life. And just ending for a minute to pass on to Christian that obviously one of my biggest dialogues is always with men. You know, I love men, I live with them, I have a son, I had a dad, you know, it's not an either or in terms of power. But needing to work out what is a good dialogue that helps many different kinds of men shift their sense of certainty so that they could accommodate the idea that they don't need to be finally the patriarch, but they could actually just be equal. Trying to find a way that one does that with love, but without negotiating away all one's own power is a constant imaginative experience. And I'll just end it there and pass on.
Thank you, Jude. And thank you, Dr. Williams. And it's a real honor to be here. But I think it's also a privilege to be here given my story. My move away from violent extremism began 25 years ago in 1996 when I walked away from the American white supremacist skinhead movement that I'd helped create in its earliest years. I spent 8 years as a part of that movement, of that hate movement. I was recruited in 1987 when I was 14 years old. And the way I was recruited was that I was standing in an alley. I was smoking a joint, and a man came up to me and he pulled the joint from my mouth and he looked me in the eyes and he said, "That's what the communists and the Jews want you to do to keep you docile." In all honesty, at 14, I didn't know what a communist was. I didn't know if I'd met a Jewish person, and certainly didn't know what the word docile meant. But it was the first time in my life that I felt as though somebody had paid attention to me. I want to take a step back, though, and tell you a little bit about my upbringing, because prior to 14 years old, I was not raised as a racist. In fact, my parents are Italian immigrants who came to the United States in the mid-1960s. And when they arrived, they were often the victims of prejudice in some cases. They also exposed me growing up to people from all over the world, to people with different backgrounds and different religions. So it wasn't a lack of diversity or exposure to diversity that sent me down that hole. But it was partly due to the fact that my parents, as immigrants, had to work extremely hard to survive in a new country. They spent 7 days a week, sometimes 14 or 16 hours a day, trying to run a small business that kept them away from home. So growing up, I often felt very abandoned by my parents, even though I knew I was surrounded by a lot of love from grandparents and aunts and uncles. But having grown up in this small Italian enclave on the south side of Chicago, I really I wasn't mature enough to understand what I was searching for at that point. And that the reason I felt abandoned was because I certainly didn't have the maturity to try and explore those feelings with my parents. So I went looking elsewhere for it. And I think it's important to say at this juncture, in the time that I've left the movement, which was in 1996, I've spent the better part of 20 plus years trying to help people disengage from those groups. And one thing that I found that is very important, and it also mirrors my own experience, is that it wasn't primarily the ideology that drew me to that movement or the people that I work with. It was a search, a broken search, or a compromised search for three very important things that we all search for. It was a sense of identity, a community, and a purpose. And those were three things that I struggled with as a young man. I had felt invisible. I had felt like I didn't have a family structure. I felt without agency or without power and was idealistic and was searching. And when that man found me in the alley, he suddenly was able to deliver, although in a very false way, those three very important things. But we also have to ask ourselves, since we are all searching for identity, community, and purpose in our lives, in fact, they define our values and really who we are, what sends somebody towards extremism? And the way that I describe it is, in our life's journey, we hit and encounter what I call potholes in our life. And potholes are traumatic or adverse experiences. They can be abuse, they can be loss or grief, they can be poverty, they can also be privilege. Privilege can keep us, if it keeps us too separate from humanity, can also detour us to the fringes on that search for identity, community, and purpose. And on the fringes, like that man in the alley, for me at 14 years old, on the fringes, there are people who are very loud in trying to fulfill the voids of identity, community, and purpose for people searching, although, and albeit very toxic versions of that. In the 8 years that I was a member, I originally was just a member and a follower, then became a leader, and eventually became a propagandist, somebody who used fear and rhetoric to recruit other people, and was very well versed on the idea of trying to fill those voids of identity, community, and purpose. And in fact, the hate movement in America and globally uses a phrase called family, faith, and folk, which is almost a literal translation of identity, community, and purpose. So they know very well that they are looking for vulnerable individuals who are searching for answers. Having analyzed my own experience, I know now, and I've known for a long time, that what drove me was not hatred of other people. It was a hatred of myself, really, that I was projecting onto others. It was a low self-esteem, a low self-confidence, and an inability to deal with the traumatic experiences that I had come across as a young man. In helping people disengage from hate groups, which is what I've been doing the last 20 years with my organization, dialogue has become the most important part of beginning that process of disengagement. The first step is creating a rapport. And the next step is, I think, something very important to the process of communication, which is sometimes forgotten, is I listen. Instead of speaking, I listen, and I try as much as I can to filter out the noise of ideology and listen for those potholes that were the motivators of what led people to hate somebody else. And then with the help of others, I become a pothole fixer. And what happens, and I don't use this term loosely, but what happens magically in some cases is, through the process of self-reflection, self-repair, and surrounding yourself with people who can create a safe place for change, it is the one thing that I've seen break hate most consistently, along with pairing that with meaningful interactions with the people that we thought that we hated, the other, as Dr. Williams said. And we realize over time through this process that we are all compromised in our search for identity, community, and purpose. We are all broken to some degree. And in fact, that universal brokenness is the glue that will actually keep us together. So I'll end it there and turn it back to Dr. Williams, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you, Jude. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Christian, and thank you, Jude. That's done exactly what I think we hoped would be done by these presentations, giving some real flesh and blood particularity to the issues. And I wonder if I could start the discussion just by pointing out one area of overlap between points the two of you made. Jude, you talked about how growing up you felt that an increase in status actually meant an increase in separateness. And Christian, you mentioned that the separateness of privilege was part of the problem, was one of the potholes. I wonder if, Christian, you could say a little bit more about the way in which that status separation thing works as you've seen it in this context. We can understand a bit, I think, about how deprivation, more obvious kinds of deprivation work, but privilege too brings its potholes. So maybe a little bit about that?
Sure. What I've seen in some cases, and I think that there is a stereotype that most people who find their way into hate movements must come from miserable circumstances. They're uneducated. They're without jobs. Essentially, the opposite of privilege, and I think that that's a misnomer. And what I've seen is that oftentimes privilege or unchecked privilege can itself be a tremendous and a profound pothole because it keeps us so separate from the humanity of others. It can, anyway. Privilege kind of fuels in us this need of self-preservation, of protecting that privilege that we found, without looking at how that might affect other people. And I think that can send us into a place where we are the epitome then of us versus them. And I think when it comes to redemption, when I look at redemption, the redemption angle of accountability and privilege, redemption without that accountability or maintaining that privilege is just another form of privilege. So when I work with people, or even in myself, when I've gone through this redemption over the last 25 years or trying to seek it, accountability and acknowledging my privilege has always been at the very top, because I've seen in the past how it's kept me and others from really embracing other people.
Jude, does that ring bells for you?
Yes, I was thinking about the issue that's often discussed around leadership styles, and that, if you like, part of auditioning to be legitimate as a leader, if you are a woman, if you're Black, if you're trans, non-binary, if you are LGBTQ plus, if you're anything that's sort of perceived to be other, then you're often in a state of auditioning to demonstrate that you can fill those boots. And if the boots that you're looking to fill are the product of privilege, they often are quite toxic boots. Not always, but they have things about them that, as a style of leadership, you might think are oppressive, but you're drawn or pushed or seduced or whatever to imitate that. So a lot of people criticize people who reach that state of leadership from a minority position and then reenact, if you like, the same activity in the same style. And obviously children do that with their parental style, etc. And I think, for speaking as a woman, it's a massive dilemma, because women are often saying, we want to fashion a different way, a consensual leadership, a listening leadership. We want to do that, and we don't want to have to pass the test of having been a male leader first in order to then move on and be a woman leader. And I mean, then this is kind of refers back to this problem of having to fashion a world that previously doesn't exist, so that you have no approval ratings in advance. And I think that idea of the power that comes with status and then locking it in to behavioral activity is something that is very bewildering. And you'll see that acted out by a lot of young people, because even if they come from a different cultural perspective, they'll look to pick up on imagery of power and then place it within their own methodologies. And it tends to be brutal. It tends to be brutalizing. A love of power, I think, is bad for us all. So, often people say, well, look, a woman came to power and she was no different. And I say, well, because she's modeling a leadership that the world has given a big tick to. And, maybe we need to step back and rethink that.
One possible implication of what you've just said, Jude, is that if we're to have a form of power in the world that isn't going to be destructive and unjust, then there's got to be some disempowering as well as empowering going on in the processes of engagement and dialogue. We have to look, as you said yourself, look not only at the areas where we're challenged, but also the areas where we are privileged and where we've been allowed perhaps not to be accountable.
There's a wonderful essay that I'd encourage people to read. It was written in 1989 by Peggy McIntosh, called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And it's about white privilege. And it's about the idea that you carry around on your back this invisible knapsack, which you're not even aware of. And it's full of stuff that gives you privileges. Like, I can walk into a music shop and all the kind of music that I'll want to hear will be there for me. at a more obvious level, I can drive my new car and nobody's going to stop me and ask why I've got one. There's lots and lots of things in this invisible knapsack. And I think that each element of power and status has these elements that are invisible to us. And it is our job, I think, the more we have agency, we've got to say, the things that I see you preventing me from will be mirrored in what I'm doing to somebody else, because the world has been constructed around these very, very intersectional and different ways of organizing power. And Kimberly Crenshaw, who's the African-American academic who created that phrase, intersectional, 35 years ago, in relationship to labor laws, actually. I mean, she definitely didn't know how deep inside our modern culture that language would start going. But I'm glad it is, because, I don't think of my story now as like men and women. I think of a mosaic of power that includes patriarchy, but it also includes racism. It includes lots of things. And it also includes something which I don't think we've got a name for yet, which is adults' relationship to children in terms of power. That I believe, within another couple of generations, we will be examining with the same kind of interrogative language as we're looking at gender politics. So I think it's a fascinating and evolving space of having to disrobe. And, often people think when I'm going to get rid of my power, they sort of seem to think, well, I have to give up my job. But if you think about LGBTQ+, so I am the grandmother to a little boy of 2 women. And how has that changed my power? Because, I'm able to feel at ease in a world where people choose their partner. It doesn't change my power at all, actually. It just stops me believing that a particular way of thinking has to be the only way of thinking. And I think that power is much more about thinking than it's about, whether I get onto that table or not.
That's a very interesting insight, I think, about power. And I'll come back to that in a moment. I just wanted to mention one of the areas which I was made aware of last year, quite simply dealing with issues around Black Lives Matter in the setting of my college in Cambridge, listening to a student from an African background talking about where would she go to have her hair done in Cambridge. Simple as that. One of those things which, as you say, is utterly taken for granted, and we don't reflect. But just trying to bring this back to Christian for a moment. Part of what you were saying, Jude, about power and thinking is that one of the things that gives us a sense of power is, isn't it, a sense of innocence and rightness? And letting go of that is extremely hard. It means it's hard to look at a history which is bound to be a very mixed bag. And I don't know, Christian, if that was part of what your own personal revolution took you through, recognizing that there just wasn't a place of absolute innocence and righteousness, and that somehow our solidarity with one another required us to let go of that particular myth.
It's a really great point. To Jude's point, I would just say that in reframing the power issue, I don't think anybody who has power has to lose it to empower those who are marginalized. Just because there isn't, because adding an African hair salon doesn't mean there has to be one less salon, for everyone else. So I think that reframing that's important. For me, in innocence, I feel as though I was very innocent at 14 years old. I feel as though I did live in this very closed Italian American bubble where the families that I lived next to on the south side of Chicago came from the same villages that my parents had come from. So it was this very closed, very comfortable, very safe community where people were afraid of losing what they had come with. And I think that fear was part of the fear of losing something of great importance was part of my own radicalization. I think the important thing that man in that alley said to me after he pulled the joint from my mouth and started to recruit me was, he asked me what my name was. And I was afraid to tell him my name because Picciolini is not an easy name to pronounce. And growing up, it was a point of bullying for me. People had bullied me and made fun of me for my last name. So when he asked me, I was afraid to tell him, but I did. And instead of shaming me for my name, he instead put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "That's a fine Italian name. And that's something that you need to protect and something that somebody wants to take away from you." And that's when I sort of lost that innocence because I had never really seen the world in that way. I'd always felt as an outsider, but I'd never felt as I was a victim. And the victim narrative that he used on me, this false victim narrative, because certainly I never saw any evidence of what he was saying. I never saw evidence of anybody, committing crimes against people for their race or stealing in my neighborhood and things like that. It was creating this narrative of victimhood that suddenly I was afraid of losing something of great importance. And not only that, he tasked me with losing my innocence and replacing it with becoming a warrior, of somebody who had to now protect that from being stolen. So it was this switch, this replacement of innocence with something of valor to protect that innocence that was being lost. So he saw in me somebody who was idealistic but shy, but willing to protect the only thing that I found comfortable in my life was this idea of being an Italian American, having grown up in a household where my parents spoke Italian instead of English, or losing that innocence or losing something of great importance, I think, and that uncertainty that is underneath all that is really the biggest ingredient right now in what we're seeing in the world in terms of polarization or extremism is this idea of fear of losing something great. And I would even go further and say that ignorance, hatred is born of ignorance, fear is its father, and isolation is its mother. And we are both afraid now and so very isolated from each other that this, unfortunately, I think is a perfect storm for what we're seeing now. And I think we're right to start to try and analyze it and get in front of it.
I know there's a lot of justifiable terror about the polarization, but there is also an incredible sweep of solidarity at a global level around the things that people are trying to share and change together. So, I mean, we're drawn, and studying the media draws us to the kind of dystopian narratives. But my actual personal experience through WOW, Women of the World, for example, all over the world, is that certainly women, trans and non-binary are building an amazing dialogue of optimistic stamina as they're building a new future. And that a lot of their sons and husbands and dads are encouraging them. So, I think there's a different tone of progress happening, and that probably accounts for the extremity of shouting from people who want to grab the microphone because they feel that change making them lose ground. So I just want to say I'm actually optimistic. I recognize the danger of the polarization, but I don't think that is the actual dominant experience. I think it is a very, very dangerous element, but that's not the same as it's the dominant element.
I think that's important. We can tell ourselves stories that paralyze us, and that's not going to help anyone. But I think what you've just put your finger on really is the way in which moments of hope, moments of positivity seem to bring with them almost automatically these reactions from people who feel that all that they have learned, all they're sure of, their thinking is undermined and therefore their identity. But building on that a bit, and again, picking up something from Christian's story is, you might say, a story about somebody who was taught to be a victim, to be angry in a certain way, to direct that anger in a certain way. Is it true that let's say children have to learn racism, prejudice, whatever, is it always something that is conveyed to them? And if that's the case, where do we start encountering that, turning it around? What do you think, Jude?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that my experience of watching children all the time is that they are interested in otherness, but they're not necessarily assuming it stratifies the power base, and so they do recognize that one's got yellow hair and one's got red hair and so on, one's got black hair, but they don't begin by thinking that that means anything. And I think that we don't understand how much our societies are riddled with histories and narratives that normalize prejudice, but they are. And and I think part of the current horror about like decolonizing, for example, or depatriarching, is like, surely we can't get rid of all of that. Oh my God, that is like who we are. Are you saying we should get rid of our entire civilization? Because what will we tell our children? What stories will we give them, etc., etc. And actually, I must say, I am perplexed. It is really perplexing. I've got a boy and a girl grandchild, and they are already stepping into strongly gendered places in terms of the cartoons and the pictures, books, and even walking around an art gallery or anything. And what do? Do you do the sort of the scorched earth Chinese revolution? Everything's got to go and start it over again. And we've seen the terror of that and the inadequacy of that as a response. And yet, there's just not enough time to go around kind of recontextualizing absolutely everything before it hits the nerve. So that's the thing that I find the most difficult. I do think that when people say, can't you just leave history as it was and, we'll be making a new history, are being naive, because we are reinforcing and reinforcing and reinforcing through, in a sense, the status that history acquires. History is somehow the truth. And that means that it's very, very hard to sort of say, forget all that and let's rethink it. But I think with children, you have to. I think, we have got to educate them away from norms that we've got to shed like skins for ourselves. And it's not an easy task, but it shouldn't be perceived as ridiculous. And that's what I'm seeing at the moment. That a lot of people are almost implying that it's, way too extreme to talk about decolonizing things, because surely it'll just kind of seep out of the system eventually. Well, hundreds of years maybe, but do we want to wait that long? So I am interested in how we tell children very different narratives, and what do we have to do about the kind of accumulation of our canon in order to be able to let that happen, with no solution, by the way, from me.
No, I doubt whether any of us will have a nice clear policy on this, because we are living in a time of transition when the pendulum may swing wildly in some ways. Some things may appear extreme and ridiculous, and yet there is a problem which cannot be denied. And part of the problem is, as Christian was saying, the assumption that change must mean loss for me. It must mean that something I value has to go. Is that the case? Or is there a way of saying in our history, there's more than one way of telling this story? And I must say, I find that notion that just communicating there's more than one way of telling the story is a way of saying, we're not denying, we're not burying uncomfortable facts. We're just saying, learn to see more than one perspective. I've sometimes said that I'm quite grateful for growing up in Wales, well, for many, many reasons, not least rugby, but also because in secondary school, we had to do Welsh history as well as English history. And, they weren't always the same story. Sometimes the same events looked at from different perspectives sounded very, very different. And I thought that was a real gift for us growing up in Wales, that we had from the start the sense that there was more than one story about the British Isles, and more than one story about political developments, educational developments, and that having that binocular vision is quite important if we can find ways of communicating that. Christian, you come from a context where growing up, as you might say, in a multicultural, a bicultural environment with Italian spoken in the home. Again, that's something, isn't it, which reinforces a sense from the start that there's more than one story to be told, more than one language to be spoken. And that must have factored in a bit in your learning and your teaching since then.
Yeah, it did. I failed to see that though after 14 until I was 23. I failed to recognize that my parents were themselves immigrants. I failed to, recognize that the diversity of culture in the area where I grew up in Chicago was additive and not subtractive. And to address a question earlier, I did learn that. I did learn to wear hate as a shield, to thinking it was protecting me. I really think that we're living in a time, at least in my country, where when I talk about identity, community, and purpose being sought by people and them hitting potholes along the way, we can also put that into the context of our society. Our society, my country, is desperate right now to establish its sense of identity, community, and purpose, and is in turmoil because we have completely ignored our own historical potholes. You had mentioned that you were grateful for having learned Welsh and English history growing up. There are parts of my country where, in the same country, depending on where you are, you may learn about slavery different. You may learn about the American Revolution different, or you may learn about the Civil War differently. And some people may say that the Civil War occurred because of slavery, and while in the South, some people may say it was because of the aggression of the northern states. So in our own country, we're not even learning our own history correctly. And in fact, in both of those histories, there are voices that are completely absent from telling that history the way it was told. So I do think that there is a real danger in us not addressing the truth of our histories and coming to some sort of a reconciliation about that. Because going forward, we're painting that portrait with one color, or singing that song with one note. Imagine adding more notes and more colors to the palette and being able to tell a more rich history that we can learn from going forward. And I think, like Jude said, there's a real danger in 100 years down the road. What is it going to be like if we continue to avoid that history? If we continue to avoid the history that we are making now? That is so important. And I think that we need to learn to be comfortable with that vulnerability of ourselves.
Peter Brook, the wonderful theatre director, talked about different kinds of theatre. Well, let's just explore that in terms of different kinds of art altogether. And that the purpose of art is to help you understand what it is to be a human in the world, in the material world and the metaphysical world. And that there is a kind of theatre which is called reassuring theatre, that people yearn for. But that's not the same as a theatre that will open up doors for you, open up new vistas, open up new windows, which we really require in order for change to happen. So as somebody who's made theatre and created art all my life, I feel very strongly that art, although lovely and reassuring at times, can be a dangerous part of maintaining people's certainties, because it repeats the narrative that makes you feel, oh yes, I do know who I am, because this film is telling me again. And I'm thinking about like cowboys and Indians, and there's so many versions, and I think Hollywood is central to one set of worldviews that reinforces certainties. We've got our own version in the British film industry, all to do with bonnets and stately homes, and it's the arts doesn't like to be criticized for this, but I want to say it's just as powerful and toxic a component in maintaining an idea of who you are that stops change happening, despite art saying it's such a transformative place.
Can I be the flip side of positivity to that one as well? And I do believe that art can be the truest form of empathy to experience, because when we experience art, whether it's on a stage or through a painting or through music, we are putting ourselves in the shoes of that artist to feel what they felt, to understand the message that they're trying to convey. So I think in this sense, I'm the one maybe who has a little bit more hope through art, that it can be a way for us to connect with compassion in our empathy.
And I agree with that totally too.
I think one of the things we have to say about art that lasts, isn't it, that it's something which certainly can reinforce our sense of who we are, but it does it not just by endorsing, stroking, echoing, but by saying, you know, what you have and what you are has resource enough to step out into the unknown a bit, and to be strange to yourself, and to ask the questions and live with the questions. It's the old negative capability thing, that good art allows me to pause about what I think I'm sure of, and just entertain that extra dimension of growth. But all of this is taking us, of course, to the awkward question of what can we actually do in, let's say, in education, to take forward the kind of agenda we're talking about. If it's true that children do have to be socialized into prejudice, adolescents need to be taught how and where to hate, then what's the essential set of components that we might want to bring to the educational process to turn that around? Christian, any thoughts on how you'd start constructing a school curriculum that might address this?
Yeah, I think as adults, we underestimate young people. We underestimate their idealism, their ability to learn and to be passionate about things, and to drive things if they have some agency. So I think as adults, as teachers, as parents, we need to learn to be more vulnerable with our young people about ourselves. How can we expect them to learn to be vulnerable with us and to share their challenges, their confusion, if they see us as infallible, as superheroes, as people who are always right? So, maybe part of that process is just making young people comfortable with communicating the things that are challenges. I have ideas about our schooling system. I do really think that at the high school age, from the age of 14 to 17, that young people should be learning in the real world. They should be out of the communities where everybody sounds and looks exactly the same as they do, and they should be working to understand, civics and how the world works. Maybe it's the last 2 years. We have 4 years of high school in the United States. Perhaps it's the last 2 years of high school where they're taken out of the classroom to learn in different situations that teach them about government, that teach them about civics, that teach them about humanity, and we pay them to do that as part of their CV and learning. And unfortunately, in our country, we don't have access to free education in terms of college. So perhaps part of that payment could be to fund their education. So it would be filling 2 buckets of teaching them in the real world, but also empowering them to move forward with some skills at the next stage.
Jude, any thoughts on education?
Well, I said earlier that I thought that in a few generations on, we'll review our relationship with children and see it as something that was unevolved. And I think that, we, even in my lifetime, the conversations about the way that the brain is shaping and the thoughts and emotional frameworks are created in 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds as absolutely formative. I mean, that has given us knowledge that we didn't have, and we should be using it, although often we're not. I think that the idea by the time you're 7 or 8 that you have a moral imagination and a sense of agency, but then you're not allowed to use it in any way, is a real problem for young people. And we often kind of talk about adolescence and acting out and all kinds of stuff as if it's just a sort of norm that they just have to go through and get out the other side of. But maybe it's not that. Maybe it's a genuine sense of, I could do so much more, but I don't know where to put my agency. And so I think that if you whether you want to watch Greta Thunberg or Joan of Arc, there's always been examples of very young people knowing exactly what a moral compass ought to look like, and then thinking, how do we turn that into action? So I think to stay with this idea of dialogue, the conversations that begin with, shouldn't we share our toys? And aren't we all equally entitled to have a happy time today? That shouldn't just be something that you do to reprimand and kind of sort out the sandpit. It's something that really should begin as the natural way that we're teaching humans. And then I think we should be listening to children and learning from them. So I don't think there's enough co-education. We're talking about co-education being boys and girls. I think co-education should be adults and children. Most parents don't have the time or space to learn from their children in the way that we're discussing, because they're basically, organizing the household, and that's not the same thing. So I actually think there's a lot of radical change needed in education to stop being all about subject matter and fact, and make it about evolving the kind of consciousness that will lead us to the next phase of civilization.
I was really struck by what you said earlier about how, looking back, we'll wonder how we ever tolerated our attitudes to children. And it strikes me again and again when we have our discussions about education in this country, and I'm sure in the States as well, the focus is always get them through this onto the next stage, get them ready for the world of work, make sure that they've got everything in their pockets to equip them to be the kind of adults we are. And I really don't think that's a particularly constructive philosophy at the end of the day. We can qualify that, as I think Christian was saying, by making sure that in some sense we're helping our youngsters to become citizens, but there's more than that too, isn't there? It's not just being a citizen and knowing how society works, it's also knowing something of how actual human community works. And once you say that, then a great deal of what we now take for granted does look worse than useless. Which is why I'm still very interested in those alternative philosophies and methods represented by Montessori and Steiner schools and all those other things, where you assume that you've got to have a human-sized unit to work with in terms of the number you're dealing with. You assume that there's a real conversational element in learning. And you assume something about the agency, Jude, that you were talking about, and the sense of moral substantial presence that children really can have and exercise. So, as I said at the beginning, Inspire Dialogue does have a real interest in exploring these dimensions of education, and everything that we've been talking about this afternoon, I think, utterly reinforces that sense of urgency there. And also, Jude, you were saying, as Christian was too, that part of what you would hope our rising generation will learn is something to do with solidarity, not just as a kind of, kind of ambulance measure or a kind of crowd control, but a solidarity that helps young people expect to be involved with one another in a certain way.
Yeah, if you look at the climate change debate, what a shared need there is across the world for us to link hands, all ages, all backgrounds, all cultural perspectives. We've got to do something together, and that's a call out to humanity. And and if at that point people start saying, well, I think I'm more important than you, aren't I? Then we've lost the plot. So I think that in the doing of some of the things that are urgent, I think that a solidarity arises that people realize is necessary and practical. And actually, this is why I'm optimistic, I suppose, because I feel as if it's an evolving understanding in humanity, not one that's been there and then gone away again. Although obviously things rise and fall. There are always those elliptical things, but in general, I think that we are understanding how to have progress through dialogue and solidarity with people who we need because they're not us, because that's not our lived experience. And I'm really interested in the idea of devolving the notion of the expert to the people who have the lived experience. I know these are phrases that have become very sort of pat, but we all know, well, if Christian's a living example, Christian's ability to discuss extremism will be 100% more effective than somebody who sort of learned at university to think about it and go and talk about it, because you're the real deal. And that is true of all kinds of issues. So we've got to value, in this kind of way of creating solidarity, people whose status is not what the world gave them, but what we believe the world ought to have given them. And I think that's up to us to kind of keep reviewing our sense of how we see people. We've got to see people differently.
I think we're getting to the end of our conversational period now, and perhaps we should move to a few concluding remarks, summing up what we'd like to leave ourselves and our listeners with. So, Christian, could I come back to you and ask you for some observations on the conversation we've been having?
Yeah, and I think that there are a lot of ways that what we all do in our different spaces dovetail perfectly with each other and overlap quite nice. We are living in a time, I think, right now where we must challenge the norms, because the norms of history have, in certain ways, created these divisions. Progress shouldn't be something that is scary. I just want to reflect just a moment on my own experience having disengaged, or the process of disengaging. For those 8 years that I was involved, there wasn't a day that went by that I didn't have doubts about what I believed in. It wasn't a part of my DNA, so to speak. I had to learn it. But I became very comfortable with it during those 8 years. Along those 8 years, though, there were moments where I had encounters, I had experiences, I had revelations to new information that challenged what I believed. And although it wasn't their responsibility, it was the people that I thought I hated that really were the most courageous during that time who tried to help me. And it certainly wasn't their responsibility to do that. It was people of color, people who were Jewish, people who were gay, who said, I see something in this person that maybe he doesn't see himself, and I'm willing to see the child and not the monster. I'm very, very grateful for that, for those opportunities, because it was the first time in my life that I had those meaningful interactions that I needed to be able to expand my worldview. And again, I want to stress this. It wasn't their responsibility to do that. They could have been my victims. They didn't have to expend their energy to be compassionate, to have empathy for me, although they saw it as a way to combat who I was. Whereas some people saw violence as a way to combat that, and that didn't work. So what I would say, just to wrap up what I think, going forward, to leave us with some hope, is that change is possible. I've seen it occur in the people that I've worked with. I've seen it occur in people that I knew very well. And the most important thing, I think, that we should try and do anyway, and it's often the most difficult, is we need to try and find the people who perhaps in our normal notions make us think that they don't really deserve the compassion, but really giving it to those who probably don't deserve it, because they are likely the ones who need it the most and might be able to benefit from it the most, and where we'll see the most change. And it's an uncomfortable thing to do, to be nice to the bad person. But if we can connect on ways that we're human, instead of debating on ways where we differ, I think we'll find that we actually can come together.
Thanks, Christian. Jude.
Yes, to pick up entirely on that, I do believe that hate and anger are massive fuels. Trauma is a great galvanizer, but in the end, I do think that love is really the great revelation for people, both self-love and when you're receiving love unexpectedly from people who you weren't giving it to, but there they are unconditionally. And I think that this is something you have to practice. And I don't think we talk about it enough. I also know from the Women of the World festivals that I do that, one of the reasons I looked at creating lots of real life stories side by side in a kind of a pattern of many stories, was because I felt that telling one story through theatre in a play for the time being wasn't giving people sufficient understanding of the fact that they couldn't just place all their chips, if you like, on the board of their own story. They had to see how it connected to all these other stories. And that made them see where they stood in relationship to many, many other people. And that actually made them happier, because instead of like feeling as if everything came down to how they would solve their thing, they could become part of this much bigger story. And, you know, it is a kind of it isn't just a sort of meditative thing like I'm a grain of sand. It's I'm a part of a change-making activity, but it isn't just fueling my anger. It can be, I can actually take my feelings and bring them to bear on your story instead. And so I mean, this is why the dialogue often suggests, you know, something that's quite intimate between two people or a few people. But in a sense, one wants a sort of critical mass of dialogue happening so that everybody can see how they sit within this pattern. I often think that idea of a mosaic floor where there's no one eye line, but there's just many, many things spreading out forever is a wonderful metaphor for how we all need to join up.
Thank you, Jude. I think one of the really important things that emerges from that is the sense that any and every creative encounter is worthwhile. It doesn't have to change everything. It can change something. And to have confidence in that is surely one of the things that keeps us going. I remember speaking to some of the young people involved in climate protests in schools in Cambridge, I think last year and the year before last. And a good many of them were quite prepared to say, look, we know we're not going to change everything overnight, but we think it's worth doing this because it's the right thing to do. And that generosity and that vision certainly is something which gives me a great deal of hope. But generally, I think if we're asking this question around dialogue of what is it that makes people confident enough to take the risks, certainly the stories of unconditional, disproportionate welcome, affirmation, love, forgiveness, however you want to put it, these are the things that animate folk. I've sometimes told a story which I came across many, many years ago, and I don't know exactly where it comes from, but imagine it's a country that's been through a revolution, a really bloody, repressive regime has fallen, and the commanders and the soldiers of the old regime are on the run. In one of the villages in this country, the villagers catch up with the leader of one of the most murderous government-backed militias around, and he's taken for trial by the village elders. And it's made very clear he's responsible for all kinds of atrocities. And eventually one of the elders says to him, so if you were in our position, what would you do? Well, says the militia commander, I'd expect you'd execute me. I'd execute me. Well, says the village elder, there's been a revolution, so that's what we're not going to do. Now, that instance of radical, groundbreaking, boundary-breaking acceptance, not denial of what's happened, not ignoring it, but just saying we're not going to do the safe things that we think we can cope with. That's where change happens. And for that to happen, it also means we all have to ask, what's left of us when certain things are lost, when certain confidences, certain securities, certain bits of status are lost, certain comfort blankets are lost? Is there anything left of me? Well, yes, is the answer. Yes. I, as a Christian, would say it's the image of God in you. It's the child, not the monster. There are any number of ways of talking about this. But something's left. When many of the things we rely on are lost, there is a moral reality there, which is worth engaging with, worth nurturing, worth feeding, and above all, worth delighting in, like your friends, Christian, who unexpectedly came to tell you there was more to you than you thought there was. So maybe that's where we might leave it, thinking about dialogue, that in a good dialogue, we emerge with a sense that there's more of us than we thought rather than less. And that's one of the points of doing it, that our horizons all round are enlarged, healed and re-energized for change. Jude, Christian, it's been wonderful sharing this conversation with you. I found it stretching and inspiring and a great joy to hear your experience. So thank you so much. Thank you once again to all those who've helped put this together, to our technical team, to Cameron for his introduction, to the Cambridge Festival for their welcome. So I hope that this little bit of conversation will spark some other conversations and some more dialogues among our listeners. And thank you to all those who've joined us. Cameron, do you want to say a few words to finish?
Wow. I really think that all that's left to say is thank you to all of our participants, Rowan Williams, Jude Kelly, and Christian Picciolini. This has been a deeply nourishing experience, at least for me, and something that I think, a conversation that will drive me, that will give me some amount of hope for the coming weeks. I'd like to thank, again, the Cambridge Festival organizers, and also to the Cambridge Filmworks, and a special thanks to our Board of Trustees and to CT Creative Studios, who are not just our producers, but our partners in everything that we do. They've been with us throughout the whole journey. And for this particular event, I'd like to just give a quick shout out to Ellen Wolfe, Aaron Arroyo, and Karen Sherlock for making this possible, and also Mandy Garner. If you're interested in the Inspire Dialogue Foundation, please send us a note at info@inspiredialogue.com. We are hoping to take inspiration for new learning ideas and projects from the dialogue today. So keep an eye out for what we get up to next, and thank you very much.